Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
Deep listening.
Intensiv zuhören.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
深度聆听.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words. Hi, I'm Oscar Trimboli, and this is the Deep Listening podcast series designed to move you from an unconscious listener to a deep and productive listener. Did you know you spend 55% of your day listening, yet only 2% of us have had any listening training whatsoever? Frustration, misunderstanding, wasted time and opportunity, along with creating poor relationships, are just some of the costs of not listening. Each episode of the series is designed to provide you with practical, actionable, and impactful tips to move you through the 5 levels of listening. So I invite you to visit oscartrimboli.com/Facebook to learn about the 5 levels of listening and how others are making an impact beyond words.
I think that unless there is an opening for real listening, but then also beyond the listening, but following through on what those learnings are, those brands will sadly, they will just die off. So the listening between the actual starting intentions of the founder and what people today are wanting to hear were completely aligned. But what the company thought the listening was from what they think is mainstream shut them down and kind of slow down their progress in being able to be a relatable company. And we see that a lot. As far as listening goes and food, I think its biggest value is really helping us orchestrate or create a context for listening, just as much as we would for playing or celebrating, singing, dancing, chanting.
In this episode of Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, we hear from Michelle Barry, a sociocultural and medical anthropologist. Michelle explains the connection between 2 of my favourite topics, food and listening, how do different shaped foods create different listening environments, and why are pizzas round rather than square. Michelle explains how anthropologists listen differently and how they listen not only with their ears or their eyes, but with their whole being. Listen out how Michelle explains how they listen for context as well as what's unsaid. Then we travel all the way to Europe and listen to how Michelle spent some time with a customer in Europe that she absolutely desperately wanted and then discovered something really powerful about her own listening. Let's hear from Michelle.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
I've been told there's a reason pizza's round rather than square, and it's cultural. In your work as an anthropologist, what role does food play in helping people, communities, and families listen to each other?
What food can do and does, just by proxy of what it is it helps us create a context. It helps us establish whether we are celebrating a birthday party, whether we are going to a game, whether it's a formal or an informal event, whether it's intimate or very loose and, more kind of extroverted. So there's a lot of different contextual cues that food helps us establish. So if you were in the moment of feeling like you needed to have or wanted to have a really meaningful conversation, you would most likely choose a certain environment and certain types of food that would be conducive to that conversation. You mentioned this about pizza and sort of the shape. Everything that we look at in food also is rich with that symbolism. So roundness creates sort of a quieter, calmer, more open environment. It's a safer environment. It's a more female archetype. So there's different ways you can look at how food starts to establish that, whether it's symbolic. And these are often things we definitely don't sit around thinking about every day. These are really nuanced, symbolic conversations about, the importance of shape and tone and color and aromas. All of these things signal something. But as far as listening goes and food, I think its biggest value is really helping us orchestrate or create a context for listening, just as much as we would for playing or celebrating, singing, dancing, chanting. Each one of those things would probably bring a different set of food choices with them.
What do you think your anthropology training brings to you in terms of insights that doesn't exist in corporations today and is productive for them?
I think that question might have been answered differently 10 years ago. Even when I first started as an anthropologist in the business world, there really weren't any of us. People were completely confused. What do you mean, anthropology and business? That just didn't make any sense. I actually think that there's more listening and better listening today than there was 15 years ago. What I see a lot happening in companies is that companies are very pragmatic for the most part. They're very focused on the how and the what, how they do things, what they're creating, what it tastes like, what it looks like, what it costs, where to sell it. It's a lot of very tactical and more pragmatic decision making that they're trying to elicit from a conversation. When you start getting into the brand side of things, people are less concerned or interested anyway in hearing about the how and the what, more and more so today, mostly because we have so many choices. If you go stand at any, grocery shelf or go online, there are hundreds, if not thousands of choices in any given category, whether that's, pickles or yogurt. So I think, when it comes to branding, it's becoming more of a point of differentiation. And the listening is not so much about the how or the what, because those are things that many companies can mimic or claim. It's more about the why, but it's also something that consumers are less likely, or people are less likely to talk about sitting around a group of strangers in a focus group facility with a two-way mirror and people spying. I mean, it's an intimate conversation. So I think where anthropology is helpful is we create the different context. I don't interview people in the artificial environments that kind of provoke or promote or enable conversations like that. Instead, we talk with people in their native environments, in their homes. We have them, they have their own party. It's a bunch of women sitting around drinking wine, and people who know each other and understand each other's worlds already to some extent, but also not having a performative element as to more intimate conversations about your why, because why inevitably goes at a more personal level. And I think that's also a bit why it becomes uncomfortable at times for companies, is you have a lot of people, usually, especially the larger the company, and they all have their own personal whys as to how they got there. But trying to find a common thread or reason or passion or love between those people isn't something you just casually sort of sit around typically and talk about. It doesn't often rise to the top that quickly. So it requires a different style of communication and listening, I think.
What are you listening for, and what's a story that brings that to life for those listening right now?
There's a very large company that has been around for, I think at least 30 years. They have a beautiful brand and beautiful packaging, and they say a lot of the right things. But they had a sense that there was something deeper going on that had been lost from the time the company had its founder position and to where they are today. And they had been purchased by a much larger corporate company as well. So they were really trying to figure out where their brand sits today after 30 years. And they really hadn't done any specific research around it. So I got together with the consumers, with people, and we sat around and drank and talked about their worlds and their preferences and things that are important to them. And we don't talk about that company. We don't talk about that package or the thing inside the package right out of the gate. We're talking about what matters to them these days. And they started talking about a number of things, about how worried they are that their children aren't going to have an environment when they get older. They're worried about spirituality and what to teach them and what they don't want them to be taught. We talked about their own fears of controlling ingredients and what's going inside of their homes and where things might not be what they thought they were. So a lot of their kind of deeper roots of fears and desires, the kinds of things that wake you up at 2 a.m, are the kinds of things we start talking about. And then we pair that up with what the company is trying to say. And usually the company will give me some background, or I interview or listen to their leadership and sometimes their founder. And the company created a very corporate structure around the brand. Didn't want to say too much, didn't want to go too bold, didn't want to go too intimate. It was sort of playing it down the middle for what they call mainstream, I'll put in quotes, people. And when I read the narrative from the founder, which was loaded with idealism and kindness and a true mission, around the product and what that meant to the environment and what it meant to future generations. And he went out. He really went out on a deep limb, which is, why I think he attracted so much momentum 30 years ago. But he had gotten watered down in the sake of safety, which watered the larger brand down to be somewhat irrelevant anymore. So the listening between the actual starting intentions of the founder and what people today are wanting to hear were completely aligned. But what the company thought the listening was from what they think is mainstream shut them down and kind of slow down their progress in being able to be a relatable company. And we see that a lot.
What do you think the cost would have been for them of not listening in this way to the people who engage with their products?
Well, I think they just become a legacy brand that goes out to pasture and dies a rather slow death. If you look at the brands today that are coming out, the new ones, they are so marked with intention and commitment and courage and responsibility and compassion. You can't buy that, and it's difficult to fabricate it. And I think that unless there is an opening for real listening, but then also beyond the listening, but following through on what those learnings are, those brands will sadly, they will just die off.
I think many people who run companies struggle with the constant chatter that we carry in our brains, and we don't allow ourselves the time to actually practice deep listening. What Oscar does is he eloquently outlines strategies to manage that struggle between feeling like we should be leading when we'd actually probably achieve more from listening. It's relevant, it's practical, insightful, and I think most of all, it makes you reconsider what listening actually is.
In your work, you're responsible for training anthropologists in how to listen in these contexts. Take us through how you train people to listen through the lens of anthropology during this research.
I think the first piece of it is them listening with each other. It starts in close, thinking about all the different signs and signals of listening. I think that as long as we're busy thinking about what we're trying to understand or say or prove or make someone feel comfortable in an interview scenario, a lot of that gets in the way of us being able to really listen with our ears. But there's also the training of everything else. And I think for anthropologists, we're a bit more inclined not to listen as much with our ears, frankly. We're more inclined to be listening with our eyes, picking up different cues and symbols and narratives that are happening. And again, a lot of it for us is context. So what's in that environment of that person? And I don't necessarily mean their house or their city or their town. Rather, what are they wearing? What are they carrying? How are they making eye contact? Are they not? We listen for the cadence. We listen for what's unsaid. I always say a good interview for us is typically we ask a simple question, much like yourself, and you see one line on a transcript of our question, then you might see 2 or 3 pages, of that person expressing themselves with very little interruption, and letting them go where they need to go. I think some research that anthropologists do can be hyper structured, where you have what's called a discussion guide. You may have a survey even that assumes something before you go in. And our rule of thumb and my rule of thumb is always be to assume you know nothing. And I imagine that a lot of people who listen for a living try to do that. But we're trying to understand their world and make ourselves accessible and I suppose vulnerable in many ways to where they're at. There's some obvious things about making somebody feel comfortable, gaining that trust, and listening that displaces things that happen, like uncommitted opinions or certain expectations or fears or assumptions. We're purposefully trying not to put those into that space to give them the opportunity or the courage to let themselves be heard. There's different ways we do that. Some of it's readings, role playing with each other, but we practice it a lot, even just on our own, on a day-to-day basis between each other.
Michelle, if we boil down the difference between a good anthropologist and a great anthropologist through the lens of listening, what distinguishes good and great?
I think great anthropologists listen with their entire being. Anthropologists are different today. I think in the past it was about going to relatively undiscovered lands and othering other people, looking at their traditions. And it's easier to do that in some senses, in that when you're going somewhere else, everything seems interesting and different and unfamiliar and curious. And it's naturally setting the tone for being a good anthropologist and being present and really gathering all this information and doing this deep listening. Great anthropologists are the ones who have the ability to listen to their own culture and are doing it not just in narrative form, but are really looking at the symbolic cues. And increasingly, I'm very much into the idea of energetic listening. When you can't see somebody, when you have to put yourself out there in a different way and be, I think, more receptive to feeling or intuiting, I suppose, what's required for that listening to be effective. And those are things that are absolutely not trained in an institution, but I think that it's becoming a bit more accepted. So I think it's sort of a little bit of both things of hyper self-reflexivity and trying to understand your own conditions, but also like a hyper presence of moving beyond the physical and just sort of what's right in front of you, and see if you can't take that listening in just a bit more deeply.
What advice do you give the people you train to listen to what's unsaid, and how do you pause and help groups and interviews to explore what's unsaid?
I think with anthropologists, we're also supposed to be interviewers. So the temptation is that when there's a lull in the conversation, that we fill it with the next question. And I think that having the ability to have a pause be possibly very uncomfortably pregnant, that's when interesting things happen. A lot of our interviews are conducted on tape. And as soon as we turn the recording off, that's when the actual real conversations begin. That's when they feel they're being heard most, I think, and willing to be more revealing. So I think a lot of what I say to them is be uncomfortable. Be comfortable with the uncomfortable. Let that quiet get a little just to the edge of uncomfortable, and turn your recorders off, because that's the safety or the threat of not being able to speak, but that it's somehow recorded and irrevocable is scary. And I think as an anthropologist, when you're interviewing and documenting, and specifically with the intention of telling the stories, it chokes people up. There's too much fear in that once I've said it, I can't reel it back in. So we do about half of our interviews with the camera off. And the second half of the interview is usually what we're more inclined to use, because the trust has been established, the comfort's been established, and the context has been established.
Can you talk us through a situation where you've become conscious during the process of selling your services to a client that you weren't listening?
Oh, yes. Many times, especially earlier on, when I think I was more attached to the outcome of closing the project because I wanted to work on it so badly, or closing the project because my boss said that we needed X amount of revenues to hit payroll on Friday. Until I started running my own business, that was more common than not. I had an idea of what I thought our offerings were, of how unique, the outcome would be, and was very committed to being able to express that as best as I could, because I think, as again, being in anthropology in the business world was totally confusing to people. I find myself in that situation a lot, even on other fronts these days. But anytime you have to explain a new way of doing and a new output, I think you get much more engaged in this idea of making sure that they understand it and you're just talking. So you do miss out on the listenings. And I think also oftentimes they don't know what to ask. And so you have to really lean into whether there are dangling questions out there that aren't being spoken. So I've definitely, stubbed my toe on that more than not over the years.
In those earlier days, take me into one of those sales situations where you weren't listening.
I worked very hard to get an international project, and I was flying to Europe, and I had gotten us to the top 2 agencies, and we were competing with a very large agency that had dozens of people, and they were very slick and had gorgeous storyboards and all sorts of things. They flew 5 or 6 people out to their first meeting, and I was the second presenter, and I came with one of the designers on the team who met me there from he lives in Europe, and he flew over and met me, and we took the train out, which is the 2 of us, and we had some level of a presentation. I mean, that was the expectation. But I went in and I was really determined to win this dang thing, because it cost me a fortune out of pocket to get there. I loved the idea of working with another culture and really trying to understand how to communicate a different way of eating and thinking, and the rituals and relationships associated with that over here in America. I really, really wanted to birth that idea over here. So I was very committed to the outcome. And I was also very committed, I think, to assuming that they didn't understand certain things about what was going on with American behavior, how we eat. So I went over and I did the pitch, and we had a very engaging conversation. I came home, I won the project. It was a big one. And we got started. And about midway in, I realized what they really wanted was a team that had about 15 people that could crank out at a very high velocity a lot of more turnkey mechanical production, which is exactly what we don't do. And as I look back, all the signs were there. It was even in writing, and I'm sure they said it more than once. But I wanted to do the other part so badly that I missed that. And so it really ended up as a disaster. We did the first part of the project. They canceled the rest. I'd already ramped my team up. So I had the consequences of now being overbuilt as a team and having to try and figure out how to, save those relationships and, obviously a huge financial hit. But I think that was a really good lesson for me. That wasn't that long ago. Again, not being so dang committed to the outcome that as a professional listener, I didn't see something that was actually quite costly. And at first I thought it was a cultural thing. I thought maybe I just didn't understand and we had language barriers, but it wasn't. It was me.
I'm curious what we haven't chatted about, Michelle, that you think would help the audience draw a connection between the domain of listening as an anthropologist and helping them listen in their day-to-day lives.
I mean, we actually have sort of a listening pathway that's about fulfilling intentions, because the people that we talk with and work with have a very intentional pursuit of trying to get something out to the marketplace. And they believe strongly that people need this thing. So, we have layers of listening that are related to building a foundation for relatedness and alignment. Just that if you can't relate to the person, there's a very, very high chance that you can't hear them. And so that's sort of always our base. And then from there, we start moving into listening for possibilities. Then we're listening for feasibilities or workabilities, and how do they integrate some of those things, into the world. And then the last listening is for how that's going to be accomplished. So we have, sort of a set base of how we ladder listening, and that's how we manage our projects. Those are some of the stage gates, I'll call them, for what we think might be a successful outcome. But most of that is grounded in listening.
And as you summarize that listening pathway for people in large organizations or just in any organization, what level in the pathway do you think they skip or miss or don't do well?
The first one, the relatedness and the alignment. We come into a lot of companies that think they're on the same page, and what's happened is there's been a lot of exchanges and emails and a few meetings. But when you really sit down with the team and you start to listen to what they all think we're there to do, oftentimes you'll come away with just as many people in the room. There'll be just as that many different stories. So helping them learn how to listen to each other, and then helping weave together the various threads or patterns to create that foundation, we think is absolutely the most necessary. So we may spend not just, hours, but months at times, really making sure that everyone understands what they're trying to do, that they are aligned before we get going. We've seen many failed experiences of not having that and just having these little cracks in that foundation. And they start immediately jumping into possibilities and tactics and, hoping to see something happen. But when you've got a fragmented company culture that's not aligned, that really haven't communicated effectively and haven't really set their expectations out there and heard one another fully, that is almost always a recipe for disaster on our end. At least that's what we've seen over the years. So the listening pathway for us is, like I said, it's all about helping people fulfill their intentions. And that can be at an individual level inside of a company, or it could be as a group, and what they are committed to doing and what their visions and their missions are as well. So the first step for us is having a conversation, which is probably the most intense time of listening in building a foundation of relatedness and alignment. That core piece is absolutely critical to any of the other steps. being successful. You can imagine it like architecture, and that literally is the initial pour. It's the base that needs to hold everything else that you build on top of it. So that's where we're really looking for not just declaring, what the visions are, but it's also starting to understand how and what and why. That's step one, is the conversation for a foundation of relatedness and alignment. The second pillar on top of that is the conversation around possibilities. Now that you understand what it is everybody wants to do, is it still possible? Or is it a different possibility? And oftentimes we'll see that it shifts sometimes a lot, once we get that base foundation set, because it starts to get a little bit more tactical. I think that first base layer is a little more strategic, and step two is a bit more heading into tactics. Now that we know what it is, what could we do? This is more the what layer, whereas I think layer one is the why. The third step is around, is it feasible? Can we work this out? Is it doable? And if so, how do we start to put that into action? So the feasibility is, again, right on top of the possibilities. And sometimes feasibility rules out a number of possibilities, but it also helps create some focus as to what you can do. And then you may need to rejigger your conversation a little bit. You may need to listen for some different things around some new possibilities, because feasibility shows you really can't do it, or it shows you can do more. So that's kind of the third layer. And then the fourth step is our conversation for accomplishment. And that accomplishment is very much about accountability, about completions, understanding what to do when there's a breakdown, how to go back in and rework some things if necessary. So it's extremely tactical. And by that point, we're hoping that we've established a really firm base of listening so people can hear each other throughout the process.
Deep listening.
Écoute attentive.
Penne ascoltare.
Ukulalela fieleja.
I wonder if you've ever been part of a market research group. Have you been in one of those glass enclosed rooms where people are looking in at you, or worse still, they're videoing you, and it's a sterile meeting room? You've got some leftover chips, some soft drinks, and if you're lucky, maybe some alcohol. Well, what I think Michelle did so well is explain how a listening environment can create a completely different context, level of openness and connectedness for your customers. As anthropologists, they always study people in the landscape where they live, and Michelle always interviews their customers in environments that are at home, with their friends, and with maybe a glass of wine. Everyday organisations are listening to customers, whether it's their complaint system or through the telephone contact centre or the website. Michelle takes listening to a completely different level, a much deeper level. I think Michelle's a really good example of what it takes to be trained as an anthropologist. You listen much more deeply. You listen at the layer of context, you listen at the layer of unsaid, and you listen at the layer of meaning. I love Michelle's 4-level listening pathway around relatedness, possibility, feasibility, and accomplishment. As someone who spends their time working in large national and multinational and global systems, it's obvious to me that quite often they don't take the time to listen to themselves, to listen to each other before they set off and try and listen to the customers. I think Michelle has created an amazing gift 4-layer listening pathway, and I hope some organisations get to listen to what Michelle has to say. Thanks for listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening. Lourdes Lascelles.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Whakarongo pohonu.
Deep listening, impact beyond words.